Thank you for that, Annie, and let me start by saying that we need to be much more skeptical of what we think we're measuring, right, and how we're using measurement and assessment. What we know now is that there's often a gap between how well you do on the test and your actual ability, right? That is, that it's not actually capturing your ability because the measurement itself is too limited, it's too narrow, right? We're seeing, for example, in the United States, lots of kids who do well on standardized tests and still end up doing poorly in college. Or they don't know how to work well independently, which are not things that are being assessed in those exams. So the first thing I would encourage you to do is to push for greater willingness to use assessment as a tool, as opposed to simply for ranking and measuring purposes. It's interesting because there have been court cases, right, in the U.S. That really pertain to school funding, right, and inequities in funding, and the courts have ruled that has forced the courts to rule what is an adequate education. Right. Well, adequacy then raises the question, okay, what's adequate? Well, then the courts have said, well, you should be able to participate in a jury. Now, to participate in a jury, you have to be able to take in lots of information, right? Fairly abstract legal information to make judgments about. You should be able to vote.
You're supposed to intelligently.
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
that was one of
you
the
should be able to
things.
read a newspaper.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a number of things that you should be able to do in terms of basic kind of citizenship, right? And I think we should think in terms of those, and then think backwards. Well, how do you demonstrate competence in those areas, right? But I think that, to me, does address some of the public's concerns, right? But also gets at something that's more authentic. So there are a number of things that I think relate to culture, particularly in relationships between adults and students, that I think were very significant for both countering the stereotypes and upholding an ethos of not just high achievement, but of high character. So be able to ask key questions about the patterns that we're seeing within a system so we have a better sense of how to intervene, right? And that's what we should be doing, right? And I think it is very important to constantly ask ourselves, are we preparing our children adequately for adulthood? Because the needs of adulthood change. They're not static. Right, and we live in a constantly changing society, and therefore we have to be willing to go back, because education is always doing two things, and this is the contradiction. We are preparing children to giving them the skills they need for society as it is, but we also have to give them the skills they'll need to address the problems that society has, which is a different skill set, because they have to then be able to hopefully have some ingenuity, some ability to imagine new possibilities that the previous generation didn't have. Otherwise, we just keep the same problems. And so that means there has to be space in the curriculum that allows for creativity and thinking, divergent thinking and things like that give kids the ability to imagine new possibilities. And that's the hardest thing to maintain a space for in schools. And I would even say universities. Because we are so stuck in thinking, okay, we have this body of knowledge, our job is to make sure the next generation gets it, very important, but we have to also acknowledge that that body of knowledge got us what we have now. And we have lots of problems this next generation is going to inherit.